Hello, and welcome to the Six Figure Developer Podcast, the podcast where we talk about new and exciting technologies, professional development, clean code, career advancement, and more. I'm John Calloway.
And I'm Clayton Hunt. With us today is Egil Hansen. Egil is a principal developer at Delegate, a Microsoft MVP and .NET Foundation member, and the creator of a Blazor test library, bUnit. Welcome, Egil.
Thank you for having me.
So how did you get started in the industry?
Oh, well, I think I started as a gamer back in the early 2000s. I played a lot of Quake, but then I sort of realized that I, couldn't make a living of being a programmer, at least not with my skill level. So I went to university and got my computer science degree while also working part-time. So it wasn't untypical in Denmark that people would, get a job almost immediately after they start computer science, and then I almost spent more time working than studying. So it took me about I guess 7 years or something to get my master's degree. But so mostly consultancy, and just working with everything from PHP and Windows servers and .NET and Drupal and web stuff. And all the way to working in mainframes when I joined the bank at some point, and then I guess for the last 7 or so years I've been working more like consultancy again. So a long story short, the more classical route, I guess.
Yeah, so a classical route and full circle back to consultancy.
Yeah, for me it. I don't know how it is in every corporation, but I joined a fairly large bank, at least the biggest bank in Denmark, maybe even Nordic countries, and there the IT was sort of a necessary evil. It wasn't the core business, and that was one thing. That was also the thing that when you are in a place like that, there's lots of interests, lots of political internal things going on, which I think is quite common to big organizations. And I liked the consultant life better, where you come out and you help another company solve a problem, and you don't really have to partake in that internal fighting. Obviously, the culture of the consultancy matters as well, but that sort of suited my temperament better.
Excellent. So what are you working on these days?
So as Clayton mentioned, I'm a principal developer for Delegate, and we're working primarily with Asia and .NET. So that's really nice. I get to really geek out on the latest technology around that. In my free time, I spent quite a lot of time on bUnit, which I guess I started about 1.5 years ago, which is a Blazor testing framework for Blazor. Yeah, Blazor testing framework for Blazor. Testing framework for Blazor. Well, according to my wife, at least, I spend too much time on that. But that's also very fun. It's like you have your own baby, and you don't have customers as such that require you to deliver in a certain schedule or time frame. Well, not directly, at least. So I get to sort of really go deep and play and experiment and get something right, or at least I hope so.
So you started on bUnit before Blazor was even GA, even server-side Blazor.
Yeah, I'm trying to think back. I started bUnit back in February or March in 2019. It wasn't called that. I had a very Microsoft product name back then. It was called the Razor Testing Framework or something like that. I have a very long, very descriptive name, but it wasn't very Google friendly because all the words in there were just random or general term keywords. But I watched one of Steve Sanderson's presentations on Blazor and got a bit excited. I think like most people did around that time, and then I started playing around with creating a component library, just trying it out and see what I could and couldn't do with it. And being a fairly big fan of test-driven development, and sort of not, kind of like to say I'm not smart enough not to write tests for my code, because it'll break very fast if as soon as I start refactoring, I'll miss something. So I realized there wasn't anything available to test your code with in Blazor at that time. So I sort of built something that wasn't really, ready for prime time at all. And it worked, but it had a few issues. Then around September last year, I believe, Steve came out with his testing prototype. And that sort of, I sort of incorporated what he had there into what became bUnit, and added. So he had a lot of things where he was able to sort of get access to the component you were testing, and be more smart about how to get the markup out of the component, and that sort of basically made what I had something I could, reasonably go out and tell people you can actually use this, and from there it's just it started getting some attention, and a small community started building around that, and people started using it for real. So it's been exciting, but it's a fun challenge to sort of be part of something like that, and suddenly have people depending on you delivering something of a reasonable quality.
Okay, so you just mentioned that you can, after borrowing some code from Steve Sanderson and mixing that with the code that you already had, you can test kind of the markup that's generated from a component.
Mm-hmm.
How do you set that up? How do you actually get it to where you can use the component in the test?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So the first thing I tried way back was just to see if I knew up my component and try to test against that like you would in a regular unit test. That doesn't really work. You quickly realize, because the component doesn't actually know how to produce output. A Blazor like Steve and the team there made a really good decision about having clean separations of concerns between what a component is and what the thing is that renders the component. And so what you need to be able to actually verify or inspect the markup that a component produces is that you need something that can take the component you want to test and render it, and then hand you back what was created. And this is sort of what bUnit encapsulates in bUnit test context, that you can ask to render a component and you can pass it parameters, and what you get back is an abstraction I call a rendered component, which contains that object contains the instance of the component you asked to be rendered, but it also contains the raw markup that the component produces. And so on top of that, I've added on top, on bottom, I don't know, but inside of that, I use AngleSharp, which is a C# based library for working with HTML, and it's actually a complete implementation of the HTML5 spec. So I pass that raw markup we get from bUnit, or from basically the Blazor server runtime, which I'm using in the backend. We pass that to AngleSharp, and then it passes that, and then we have just the same APIs we have in the browser to query the generated markup, which is now represented as DOM nodes in C#. So you can use your query selector all, and in Blazor, actually, I have sort of some shorthands for that. I have a find and find all method that takes a CSS selector. So you can go in and it doesn't feel like, I guess, UI testing in a Selenium kind of way, where you have to set a lot of things up and you have to actually run the application in a full instance, and you have a browser that you're automating. Maybe it's headlet, but it's still being automated. You're just running completely in C# and everything. You're rendering the component in C#, and then you get the output, and you can query that through the AngleSharp API. So that's I guess that's actually the quite long answer to your question.
All right, so you said that you can use the query selector all and stuff. Are you using the same jQuery style syntax for the selecting the element? Is it like a hash and then the ID of the thing and then dot for class and all that stuff?
Yeah. It's just so I'm just redirecting and doing a little bit of extra stuff, but I'm redirecting to AngleSharp, and AngleSharp has the query selector, and query select all JavaScript. Well, not it's in C#, but it's the same ones you have in the browser, and they just take a CSS selector as input, like jQuery did, or does still exist, I guess. So yeah, it's very intuitive to work with, and you can sort of say, well, I want to. Like the classic example that is my default one to show just what you can do with bUnit is to everybody have done the file new project on Blazor, and you get that click component where you are able to click on a button and you see the counter increase. And when you tell bUnit to render that, you get that rendered component back, and then you can go and say we call it a component on a test. So if you are used to unit testing terminology, we would call that system on a test, but since it's a component on a test. So we have CUT, and then you say .find, and let me find my button. So you write button as the argument to the find method, and then you can say .click on that, which will trigger the event handler in your C# Blazor component, which will cause the counter to be incremented and the component to re-render, and then you can go and say my component dot find, and then get the p tag, for example, out, which is one that is incremented there, and you can expect the text content of that. So it's very simple, and that's one of the goals I have with bUnit. I want it to be fast. I want it to be very much like writing just unit test of plain old C# objects. So yeah.
Yeah, I've been doing a lot of testing, of course, with unit testing in C# with things like XUnit. Been doing a lot with React using Jest and React testing library. And it sounds like there's a lot of similarities there in something like React testing library, where you're selecting an element, selecting a component, testing the behavior of that. In a lot of the documentation and direction on using something like that, it's very explicit that you want to be sure that you're testing behavior, not just counting DOM elements down. And because Clayton has said before that's when you're looking at that level of testing, or testing at that level, that's usually where that's most volatile, that changes very often, that the business will change their mind and want components moved, they want elements moved, they want buttons to change color and change names and things like that. Or is there any direction on how to be effective in this testing model?
I think so. I think another primary thing for bUnit is that it should lead people into writing maintainable tests, and I think that addresses what you're talking about here. You want to make your assertions such that if you change something in your code that isn't actually a change to the business rules, that you don't have test breaking. That's sort of, I think, very. Otherwise, what happens? Unit test gets commented out because people need to have that code in production, and the manager's happy. So with bUnit, bUnit doesn't dictate it. And by the way, bUnit builds on top. It runs inside XUnit or NUnit, so it's just, I guess, helpers or something that is added to those. You still need XUnit or NUnit, so that's or MS test for that matter. That's why you sort of have the same feel as you have unit test. But what bUnit does provide, and I admit I'm not familiar with React or their testing world or Angular. I spent a little bit of time just doing demos, but I haven't really done it, used those things in Angular yet. But what bUnit has is something called a semantic comparer of HTML or markup built in. And that handles a lot of those typical cases where you want to assert that the markup generated from your component looks in a specific way, but you will still like to retain the ability to reformat the markup that is generated, as long as it doesn't actually change how it would render in the browser. So maybe you have an element in your component where you add another attribute to it, or maybe you change the order of the attributes. And I'm drawing in the air, and you listeners can't see that, but imagine that you have an element and you maybe change the order of your attributes, or maybe you're dynamically generating the CSS classes you add to your class attribute in your markup, or maybe you're just reformatting white space in the sort of how the markup looks in your component. And if you use the built-in semantic comparer in bUnit to verify your expected versus your generated, it will do a semantic comparison from a browser's perspective. So it'll look at the two pieces of markup and say, well, will these two pieces render the same? And if they will, it'll say it's still okay, even if you change the order of attributes on an element, because it wouldn't change in the browser. And I think that's one of the tricks that sort of is part of bUnit. But you're definitely also, if you would like to go and for example go in and select a property on an element or an attribute on an element and verify that it looks a specific way, you can sort of traverse the DOM tree and select that out and do an assertion against that, if that is sort of the core emphasis of your unit test. bUnit doesn't really dictate any one or the other, but I think it's something that you need to think actually about when you're writing your tests. Absolutely.
So, so we've talked about the interaction with components, being able to click a button or something like that. What about interaction from component A to component B? Like if I'm doing sort of a component integration test, do I need to set up two fixtures or two components under test for something like that? Or how do I test through a component to another component? Is that?
Yeah, so I think you would see that it just works as you expect. So if you have a component that has another component as a child component, or maybe you have a parent component that has multiple child components that sort of interact with each other, in bUnit you just tell it to render the root component, the starting point for your test, and it will run just as it would in a Blazor application. It will render all the components down the component tree, and then if they have interactions, you sort of get that interaction included in your test by default. So I believe in React you have the ability to render shallow or like just test the component you're targeting right now, and if there's any subcomponents underneath of that, it'll ignore those bits. That's a feature that I am planning to add to bUnit as well. One of the recent changes that was added to the .NET 5 version of Blazor made that possible, basically allowing me to control the instantiation of components, so it will be able to sort of both mock or fake out components, but also replace them with, I guess, nothing if you're doing shallow rendering. But by default, if you have a component that has another component inside it and you have interaction between the two, it's part of the test if you render the parent component.
Go ahead.
No, you go.
What about passing parameters and cascading values, and injecting services into those tests? How do we deal with that? Or are there scenarios in which we can set that up and deal with that?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think there are two kinds, well, 2.5, I guess. But so you have services that you can inject into your components in Blazor, just regular Blazor, and they are injected in through the inject attribute, or injected in through just I guess it's actually just inject attribute. They don't have constructor injection now, but and then you have like you said, cascading values which come somewhere up from the high up in the render tree, and then you just have regular parameters, and then there's subcategories of different types of parameters there. So if you're just dealing with regular parameters and cascading parameters for that matter, then when you are rendering your component, you simply specify those to to the test context. So the test context has a method called render component, which is generic. So it takes the component as the generic type, and then there's sort of a builder that you pass in as the argument to the method, where you are able to specify parameters, both cascading and normal, that you want to pass into the component when it's rendered. And before you do that, if you have any services you want to inject into the component, there's a services collection in the test context where you use the same add singleton or add transient methods that you know from just your regular services collections in C# or in your program.cs file, and you can just register any services you want to pass in there. So it should be quite intuitive and straightforward.
All right. Now for the complicated question. Okay.
Okay.
So we talked a little bit before we even got started about how I'm working on a Blazor game, a Blazor implementation of monogame, and there is a lot of JavaScript interop for that. How do we test JavaScript interactions in bUnit? And with the asynchronous nature, is there specifically for my purposes, is there any way to work out the timing so that I can find out if my timings are weird? Okay,
so 2 questions, but let me answer this last one first because that's actually pretty straightforward in most cases, because the asynchronous nature of Blazor components in general and means that you will sometimes have to, and I think you know that from regular UI test, you have to wait for some operation to complete. And it might be because you have a timer in your Blazor component that basically fires every some milliseconds or every second or something that triggers a new render. What I have in bUnit is a way to say, wait for some state to arrive in my component under test, or wait for some assertion to pass. And because so bUnit only runs in JavaScript. So that leads to the second question of how we test JavaScript. We don't test JavaScript in bUnit because it's only C#, but we can test the expected interaction there. But because it's only, everything is in C#, and I have sort of a deep hook into the Blazor renderer that is actually doing the continuous rendering you might have of your components, the render will tell the test context you have instantiated every time there's a new render. So even though the default wait time is up to 1 second, if you have a render after 10 milliseconds, it'll try to run your assertions or check the state you're waiting for after 10 milliseconds. And it'll just go back to waiting until it's notified that there's a new render has happened. So performance-wise, it performs very well, it runs very fast. So the only thing you need to be aware of is that if you have a test where you are waiting for some change to the markup happening, and you don't see that, but you sort of know that it's happening, it might be because you have an asynchronous rendering going on in the background. Most of the time, even though you have asynchronous code there, if you, for example, have a mock data service that is providing data to your component, and the component in the component logic will say, await my service.get data, because you are in a test context where the data will be readily available, it's just a fake data source, maybe it's just an enumerable right there, then it won't actually go into an sort of asynchronous render. It'll just get the data right away and render right away. So you don't have to do that extra waiting in your test. But sometimes if you have something that is really async, like triggered by timers or other things like that, then you need to have that extra layer. But that's in there. But I think that's the most and fast part of bUnit, to be honest. Where things get a bit tricky with bUnit is the problem with, getting back to your first question about JavaScript and how we test that interaction, is that since it's all C#, there's no JavaScript engine running your JavaScript. It's completely ignored. We don't run, so if you have CSS animations for that matter, we don't run your CSS as well. So that also means that you don't have to wait for specific animations to complete before you can click the button and continue to the next step in your test. But back to JavaScript. So what we do is, in Blazor, a JavaScript interrupt is represented by the IJS runtime interface that you inject into your components, and from there you can say invoke async or invoke void async, and you might get data back depending on what you choose, or you have public methods on your component that has the JS invocable attribute on it. So that's sort of the two-way bridge between JavaScript and C# Blazor. But since IJS runtime is just a simple interface, it literally only has two methods on it, you just mock that. And you can mock that with any mocking tool you like, or you can use the built-in one that is in Blazor. Sorry, that is in bUnit. So bUnit comes, because it's such a common thing, so bUnit comes with a built-in specific tailored mock of, it's sort of edging towards being a fake, but semantics. That's sort of that's in the next version of bUnit, there will be an always on fake or mock of the JS interrupt, so that and with that you can set up expected calls. So if you have some custom JavaScript your component is calling, you can say, well, when you get this call with this identifier and I guess the command you want to call down or the function you want to trigger down in JavaScript, or up or over, I guess. Don't know what the direction is for JavaScript, but it's you call that you define that method, and you define any parameters you want to match on, so similar to MOQ or in-substitute or what have you. And then you can also define what value it should return back. So if it's not an invoke void async, then you sort of can provide a value back to it. So you basically fake that interaction. And you can also inspect the interactions that have been and the calls that have been received, and you can then say, well, I expected this call to happen, so you can assert against that if that is sort of an important business thing for you. And if you want to go the other way, if you want to simulate JavaScript calling into your Blazor component, well, you basically, when you tell bUnit to render a component, you get the instance back. So you just go into the instance and then you call that method directly yourself. So that sort of that's how it works, and it works quite well.
Okay. And the last part of your explanation of how we could use the JS runtime mock is that's something you're working on?
No, it should be. Now, the current version already has that. So,
okay.
But the next version I'm going to be pushing out of bUnit, which will be, I'm going from beta to preview, calling it a preview version now. So I've been, maybe it's just, my own. I want to be absolutely sure that it's completely right, but I know a lot of people are already using it, even though it's called beta. It's a quite stable beta, I guess. But anyway, yeah, the next version will have it instead of having something you opt into, a JavaScript, the fake JavaScript runtime in bUnit, it will be added by default. But if you prefer to use your own mock of the IJS runtime interface, you just register that in the services collection before you render a component, and it will override the built-in one in bUnit, and then you are, then it's sort of, I guess, it's the same as it was before. So, yeah, go ahead.
We've got a good question in chat from Surly Dev, and it kind of it corresponds to what we've been working on with the Blazor game engine. We've been treating this as a spike effectively and taking the public API of MonoGame and implementing it in Blazor and figuring out how it works without really doing test-driven development, without doing good patterns and practices. So the question in chat is, as maybe a total Blazor noob, if you're starting to adopt Blazor or tinker with it, play with it, are there good practices from starting off to how you would structure your code, or how you would make it testable, or how you would integrate bUnit from the beginning of a project?
I think the same general structure as you would follow with writing unit tests for any other DLL, any other library. There's no. So what I usually would have is I would have a separate testing project. I prefer XUnit, but NUnit works fine. And you create a test project for your Blazor components where you have XUnit added and you have bUnit added, and that's it. And then you always have a reference to your, if it's just a Blazor class library, then you have a reference to that. If it's a Blazor client or server app, you can also just have a reference to that. And then you just I guess start with the first component, write a test for that, and if you want to go, real red-green refactor test-driven development style, it's no problem at all. I think was it Ed Sherpano, and in his he did a talk at .NET Conf, the recent .NET talk about testing Blazor components, and he mentioned one of the advantages he liked with bUnit is actually because there's no hot reload yet in Blazor, which you might know from React, I guess, or similar environments. But what you can do is, because it runs so fast to test that, like it's just a unit test. So you basically, when you run your test, you get instant feedback or whether your component is performing correctly or not. So you don't have to go in and maybe step into a deeper level into your application and then find the component you want to sort of verify works correctly and then maybe do something there. So I think it's a good way to actually build your Blazor components out. But one thing you would need to do is, and that's sort of where I guess it's different from just testing Railed or plain C# object, is that you have to know what markup you would expect, what HTML you want to expect out of your component. And when I do this, sometimes I have to sometimes I have to sit in the browser and model around with moving the H1 up and down and maybe add some attributes, changing the CSS classes around to get that look I want. And you can, I usually, what I do is I will sit and I'll just have a plain HTML file in my browser and I'll experiment in that and just directly in the browser tools, change things around, change the styling, change the indentation or whatever it is I want to change. And then I will move that into my test and say, this is what I expect to get out. And then I'll write my test. And then, yeah, so that sort of could be a very, if you want a really test-driven development workflow, that works quite well. I guess in big organizations, people will get the markup directly handed to them from a designer maybe, and they just get the task of implementing that. And in that case, you basically take the markup that is expected in different use cases, and then you put that into your test, and then you can create your component based on that. But I think in general, but that's just a general Blazor thing. Separate out your business logic from your component logic. It is, and I imagine with a game engine, there's quite a bit of logic in there that has nothing to do with Blazor as such. Put that into its own classes, into its own namespace, and have just regular unit tests for that. There's no reason to involve bUnit in that. So yeah, I think that's the best advice I can give on that.
All right. So one of the things with Blazor that I have found more frustrating than it should be, and really it's the only thing with Blazor that I found frustrating, is the authentication and authorization. And it's mostly probably because I'm having to create a custom authentication because we already have authentication at work, and I have to make Blazor work with that authentication. But I have run into issues where the authentication kicks in, like say the JWT runs out, and so the page goes into its unauthenticated state, and then you relog in, and when you relog in, the state of the page that you had is lost, even though it was just an in-page tag for the authentication. You weren't actually redirected to login or anything. How can you test authentication with bUnit?
So yeah, that's an excellent question. I had a community member who had that exact problem. And again, authentication is just a matter of some services you inject into components, or a parent component that you render your components underneath. That is sort of how the basic Blazor structure is. So, but there was a community member who had that challenge, and I've had multiple questions on that. So he took it upon himself to create a fake authentication solution for bUnit, where you basically just you can choose to add that when you want to write components that require any of the different authentication primitives that are in Blazor. And so yeah, and then there's a whole, I can't go through all of it, but basically you just say add fake authentication to your test context, and then you get an object back where you can control the authentication mechanism. You can go in and say set username to something to sort of emulate that people has been authenticated, and you can go in and set roles, and you can go in and set claims token as well. So all of the things, building blocks you have in authentication is available through that fake authentication mechanism there. So that allows you to control quite precisely what should happen in the different cases. So I actually haven't tried it out, but I assume that you can start out in an unauthenticated state. Then you can write a test where you change to authenticated, and then you can go in and change it to not be authenticated again, and then you can do an additional step in your component and see that it actually responds correctly to the changing of the authentication state.
Okay. So, I mean, that actually sounds fairly simple, a lot simpler than I would have expected. Just add authentication and then set the authentication state to...
Yeah, it wasn't the smallest pull request I've gotten. It's certainly not simple, but he managed to make it simple, and we worked a lot with APIs to make it intuitive for folks to use. So yeah.
Yeah, you know, they say simple isn't easy, so...
No, certainly.
Yeah, I definitely appreciate those that make the complicated simple. So kudos to those that are doing that work.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. It's that's also, I guess, the general goal as well with bUnit. It should all the most common things should just be simple and straightforward. So that was definitely a line. I would like to add more fake stuff to bUnit. For example, a fake navigation manager. Because the current built-in navigation manager in Blazor obviously depends on the browser, and when people click around there or type in new URLs or navigate away, and it's a fairly simple thing to fake yourself or mock, but it would be sort of a nice thing that people don't have to go out and find and figure out how to do that. That should just be something in there that just works as expected. So right now I just have a stop. And if you try to use a navigation with bUnit, it'll give you an exception that tells you that what you need to do basically. But in the long term, I think it would be nice to have all of those basic functionalities that come out of the box with Blazor, like navigation and JSON drop. We already talked about that, and authentication and all of those other bits already be there in the package when you get that, because most people will need that anyway.
So what about snapshot testing? I know that there are a lot of UI testing frameworks out there that perform some kind of snapshot. Is that one of the functions of bUnit? Is that planned? Is that working?
Yes and yes. So it's planned because it's not complete, but there is something there. There is a feature that I'm currently sort of trying to improve upon, but it's a feature in bUnit where instead of writing your unit tests directly in C# code, you can actually write them in a Blazor component. I guess we can call that a Blazor test component, where I have some specific Blazor markup you write. You can either write, basically you have a component markup that is called a snapshot test, where inside of that component you can define your test input and your expected output. And both can be a mix of HTML and just regular components, Razor component style declarations. And when you run your unit tests, and those type of tests will also show up in your test explorer, when you run those tests, it will compare the generated output of your test input with the generated output of your expected markup. And it'll use the semantic comparer I talked about earlier. So it'll give you a very nice description of what is not correct if it's not the same. So what I would like to add in the future is having the expected markup portion automatically generated for you when you run the test the first time if you don't have one. So I'm thinking that might be a good chance for me to play with source generators, for example. Another thing that is still missing from it is also the ability to run these types of tests in other frameworks besides XUnit. So right now I only have support for, because it's definitely, there's no XUnit in there. It's just a special type of Blazor component that inherits from a base type called test component base, and then that's it that you need to do. So I need to add custom test runners for NUnit at least, as well as perhaps also MS test. But yeah, there is something there, and it could definitely be improved upon. But the basic features is there.
Okay, so two things. My head just exploded a little bit. You said that you'll be able to create a Blazor component that is a test.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, that'll be very interesting to see.
Yeah.
And then, so does it only work with XUnit right now? Can you use the extensions and helper libraries in MS Test and in Unit, or do you actually have to use XUnit for bUnit right now?
No, so bUnit is test framework agnostic. It works with XUnit, NUnit, and MS Test. But the special way of writing tests in Razor syntax is only supported by XUnit, because I've only written like XUnit is also very well designed, and it has some excellent hooks where you can basically supply your own. It's called a test framework into XUnit that allows that I've created, that allows it to discover the custom. I guess the custom tests you have defined in your Blazor test components. I can share a link in the chat with you guys, so you can. I guess it's hard to imagine that there's two types of right now. There's two types of Blazor-based testing syntax. There's one where you just have something called a fixture, where you can write out the component on the test as your regular Blazor syntax and your regular Blazor syntax, and that can be an advantage if you, for example, have a component that takes a lot of parameters, have maybe lots of nested child components underneath it. Then that can be quite tedious to write out in the C# versions of the tests there. So it might, and plus you get all the IntelliSense help from the Razor engine in Visual Studio when you do it like that. And then there's the snapshot tests, where you basically have like the test input and expected output, and you also have the ability to run a method that will set up any services you need beforehand. And that's sort of just about it for that feature. But that's only available right now in XUnit. But I hope that maybe something in version 1.1, maybe that will sort of branch out to also support NUnit, but I need to read up on NUnit's documentation before I can implement that, I guess.
Yeah, so with that, you said that's only supported in XUnit. Are there things that are supported amongst the different test frameworks, XUnit, NUnit, MS Test?
Yes, so just writing, if you use NUnit and you just want to write a regular bUnit test in, and I say regular, that's a loaded term, but if you have a .cs file where you're writing your test inside, then NUnit, MUnit, and MS Test works just well there, because you just need something that will run the tests, and all of those three, and maybe others I don't know about. If you can run your test through .NET Test in the command line, and then there's a test runner that will discover whatever test method you have defined in your CS classes. Then in those C# .cs files, in the test methods in there, you just new up bUnit test context and use that as you would any other type inside your unit tests. So it's only those Razor only test types that need custom test runners to work.
Okay, perfect. And you've already provided a couple of links, and we'll be sure to include those in the show notes. But are there other resources to help individuals get started in bUnit and or either just in Blazor itself?
So I think Microsoft has done a really good job at just documenting Blazor. If you just Google Blazor documentation, that's the best place to go and start and read through the documentation there in the docs.microsoft.com, I guess it's called. And bUnit, just go to bUnit.egilhansen.com, and I'll send a link there. There's I spent quite a lot of time writing a lot of documentation. And so there should be there's getting started sections, there's providing input sections, there's interaction sections where I talk about how to trigger event handlers, how to trigger renders. Sometimes you want to trigger re-render manually. That whole about waiting for the asynchronous state changes. And then there's a whole section about verifying output, markup, and component state. Also how to customize the semantic comparer. So for example, if you want to exclude some parts of the generated output from a component in your comparison, you can do that. So you can sort of fake or emulate shallow rendering, I guess. So hopefully there's lots of details there in the documentation. Otherwise, people can come find me on bUnit's Gitter channel. There's a link from the homepage to that. And also a good place to ask questions and learn more is to come into bUnit's GitHub repository, where there is a discussion page, the new discussion feature of GitHub. I'm using that, so that's a good place to come and ask questions if you have something that doesn't work. Also a good place. I really appreciate if people come and provide feedback, say this is hard to test, I can't get this to work. And sometimes, there might be a thing we can do in bUnit to make certain scenarios much easier. So definitely reach out that way as well.
All right. So as we wrap up, what has been helpful in your career that you might share with those getting started or those looking to level up their careers?
So it's been a long time since I actually started. So thinking back, what I've wish I would have known or learned faster would. And especially if you are a little bit, if you're like me, that is sort of a little bit of a perfectionist, wants to get things right. So there's two things related to that. Is so if you go and read a lot, there's a lot of excellent books like Refactoring or Clean Code, those classics. But don't take those as too dogmatic, because if you have perfectionistic tendencies, you can get stuck and really spend a lot of time just making the code look a bit prettier, a bit more clean, trying to live up to what the gurus tell us it should look like. What I've been forced to learn while working as a consultant and working for other people's money is that sometimes things doesn't have to be perfect; they just have to be excellent. And excellent is a word I really like in this context, because it's context sensitive. Perfect is not context sensitive. It's a yes or no, but excellent can mean excellent under the circumstances. So did you only have 5 hours worth of customer time to build this thing? Then it should be as good as you can make it in 5 hours. Don't use the first 4 hours getting small details working when you can't complete the rest of it in 1 hour. So for me, and I still struggle with that at times, learning to look at things in the context of what is possible within the constraints I have for a given thing I need to build, need to implement, need to design. That is tremendously helpful. And then you also don't end up kicking yourself too hard when you produce something that is less than perfect, but under the circumstances very well. And the corollary to that is don't be too hard on yourself or your colleagues when you see some code they wrote a half a year, 2 years, 10 years ago. I remember when I was working for that bank and working I looked in some old mainframe code from back in the 80s, and nobody had touched that because it works. It's not pretty. It's not best practice by any means in 2000s or 2020s, but it was the best they could do with the time they had available and with the standards they had at that time. And so I think remember. I think, and especially when you're new, you read one of those great books that are out there, and you sort of very easily fall into that. Well, he must have been stupid, or she must have been stupid when then they wrote that code back in the whatever that it was, because clearly they're not following the best practices, and everybody. So you sort of get fired up by the holy fire of whatever the book you've read says. So be pragmatic and be excellent, but not perfect. I think that's the thing I want to work on, and I continue to work on.
Yeah, I think we've all fallen into that, so it's important to keep in mind.
Yeah.
So where can our listeners go to follow you and keep up with what you're working on?
I think the main place will be Twitter. So it's quite easy. That's just at Egil Hansen on Twitter. And GitHub is also a good place. Feel free to ping me on LinkedIn as well. That's also, I guess, /in/Egil Hansen on LinkedIn. If you want to find me there, I'm always looking for professional connections, but I'm not really on any other social networks besides those.
Okay. Well, is there anything that we missed or anything that we haven't covered?
I don't think so.
Okay.
No.
Well, Egil, thank you so much. Really appreciate you taking the time to speak with us today.
Well, thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure.
That was Egil Hansen. Egil is principal developer at Delegate. He's a Microsoft MVP, a .NET Foundation member, and creator of the Blazor testing library, bUnit.
If you like this episode, please like, rate, and review on iTunes.
Find show notes, blog posts, and more at sixfiguredev.com.
And catch us live each week on Twitch, and be sure to follow us on Twitter at sixfiguredev.
This has been another episode of the Six Figure Developer Podcast, helping others reach their potential. I am John Calloway.
And I'm Clayton Hunt. And then we fade out and everything goes away. All right. Since it's an early one, we're just going to go ahead and probably exit. So anybody in chat
You're still going up.
Yeah, no, I'm still going out. I'm saying goodbye to
Cool.
everybody.
Gotcha.
In chat. And Surly, really, is the only one talking. But there might be other people watching. So we're going to go ahead and leave. We'll be back at 6, right?
Yep.
6 Eastern Standard Time. So you can catch us there. And hope everybody has a good work day. Surly, go get some sleep.
Yeah. Surly, we'll see you back at 6 p.m. Eastern. We'll do the Twitch thing, and we will raid our friend Jay-Z over at Coding Blocks.
Oh, it's only 3 p.m. for him? He still needs to get some sleep. He doesn't sleep.
Perfect. And where are you located?
I'm in Iceland.
Iceland.
We moved here. My wife is from up here, so we moved up here 2 years ago. So I transitioned to working from home at that point.
Very nice.
So not because of the end of the world.
No. How are you guys doing with that?
I'm doing all right. Software dev's probably one of the best jobs to be in for the situation.
Yeah. Yeah, my wife is a doctor, so we certainly not, looking unemployment into the face here on our side. But but yeah, I heard that it's different for people. Some people can work from home and they're not bothered by it, but I have colleagues that they're really screaming to get back to the office and have that social interaction. So, but you haven't been having problems with that?
No, I'm a child of the 80s and the 90s. One of the reasons that I got into software was because of a lack of affinity for humans. So it doesn't bother me too much that I don't, get out and see people. But I do like hanging out with my friends, and I love doing the podcast. But outside of that, I'm not super social. And John hasn't left the house in over a year. He just stays there. His thumb doesn't work, so he can't really go anywhere.
Yeah, I just had a disc replaced in my neck, so I'm still suffering from some numbness in my thumb. I got to follow up with the surgeon. It's
Wow. Okay. Well, that sucks. But you are better now, I guess. Besides the thumb.
yeah, mostly.
How does that affect your typing?
It's mostly muscle memory now.
Yeah,
Okay.
only half of the times that he hits the space bar does it actually work.
Yeah,
Okay. Yeah.
I mean that's all I use the thumb for anyway.
Yeah. Yeah, I guess in our line of work, you really have to get hurt to not be able to actually work. Like, as long as you can move your arms, you're pretty much golden, I think.
Yep.
Oh, and have a head and eyes, obviously, but that helps as well.
Yeah, you only need one hand.
Yeah.
I found that out.
Well.
I injured my shoulder, so I had to not type with my hand for a few months. So you get used to it.
Yeah. But is I judging from your time zone and accent, I guess you are in the States right now. So how is COVID in your area? Because from what I gather from the news, it's quite it's different from state to state how well they are doing.
Yeah, we're both in Florida, Tampa, Florida area. Our third member is up in Columbus, Ohio. But Florida is historically not really on top of things, but so lockdowns were late and kind of ineffective. But Clayton's got some family members with some health concerns. I've got some family members with some health concerns. So I've been like Clayton mentioned, I've been home and not leaving the house for months and months and months. But I think all in all, I think dealing with it fairly well.
Yeah. Yeah, it is a weird thing. I was used to traveling quite often to Denmark for work, but obviously we're not doing that a lot because in Iceland they have some fairly strict quarantine rules when you get back here. So they've been very much on top of it and really do a lot of effective track and tracing. So that's nice. Schools stay open and everything keeps working, but yeah. But we have had a one or two lockdowns where they sort of closed off the gyms and few places like that. But it's also easy. It's a big island and there's like 350 people living here, 350,000 people. So it's a whole different thing. And I guess you can't really close down a state, for example, if they want to do something, or maybe even a county if they want to do something like individual, because
yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, even if they were like, okay, nobody's allowed to leave the house, there'd be a pool party somewhere. Somebody would do something, especially in Florida.
Yeah, our neighbors on both sides actually have had pool parties and invited people.
Well, you had a neighbor that had a COVID party, right?
Yeah.
Which is like somebody gets sick and so they invite over all their friends. Like
so herd immunity kind of thing. Yeah. Yeah, and what was it? I don't know if it's true actually, but there was a story yesterday that somebody was reporting that the British Prime Minister Boris Johnson was gonna announce that they would lift restrictions completely for a week during Christmas, so that people could do Christmas together like normally. But the pandemic, you can't take a vacation from the pandemic. so it's it doesn't really work like that. So you just have to suffer through. I guess you guys have Thanksgiving as well, where you have to compromise quite a bit this year.
Yep. The kid is home with us, and we are not visiting family. I think the wife is a little bit sad, but we're gonna cook and eat and do the normal Thanksgiving things, just with fewer family members in.
Yeah, and I think it's especially for international travel, it's going to be a while because even when we get the vaccine, what is it, 7 billion people, it's going to take a while to get everybody vaccinated. So it's going to be interesting to see how that unfolds.
Yeah, I'm thinking 2 to 3 years at least before.
Yeah, and at some point maybe they get everything under control to an extent where they will allow people to just go about their lives as normal, and they can deal with any spikes when they show up. But yeah,
And this is just for the bat COVID. Now there's the mink COVID, I think.
yeah. I actually came from my home country, apparently.
Somebody's eating weird animals in Iceland or Norway.
That's Denmark. Denmark, yeah. But no, I think it was basically because the mink, they have basically something. They have lungs that are anatomically very close to what we have as humans. Obviously much smaller, but so one of them. And they basically created a mutation because they have different sorts of biology in their lungs as well, but they work the same basically. So yeah, they and they're getting a lot of heat for that. But the Danish government just basically told, and Denmark was the biggest mink producer in the world before that, but they basically told all the mink it's called farmers to just kill everybody, kill all the minks, not everybody, but kill them. Yeah, so they killed the whole entire industry in Denmark just to make sure that this wouldn't start a second pandemic.
Like 150,000 minks or something like that.
I think million.
I bet that's got PETA in an uproar, huh?
Yeah, especially because obviously we have a multi-party system in Denmark, so it's not just two parties. But there were definitely some that were raising, that were asking, like, is this actually a problem? Is this going to be a problem for a vaccine? Like, would this prevent a vaccine from working? And I think actually it was called Fauci, the American primary on that. He actually was out at some point saying that it shouldn't be a problem. And that was after they told them to start killing all their minks. But the Danish health authorities and the WHO was out and sort of commending that this was the right thing to do and recommending that. So, but in Denmark, they listen a lot to the national what's called Pandemic Institute. So it's not a political thing as much as if they come and recommend something, then that's usually what happens across party lines. So, but but there's still obviously people who are seeing, is this really, really necessary? Because it's basically a full industry they're shutting down. And not just a niche thing, it's like the biggest one in the world. But I think the Chinese mink farmers are very happy right now. So they basically got a lot of business. Yeah. It's been a great time.
Yeah,
I must say.
All right. Well, we are looking at about 2 weeks out to release the episode. So unless you've got something specific you'd like us to coordinate with, we're looking at Monday, December 7th.
I don't think so. No. Hopefully, I'll be done with the preview one at that time.
Okay.
So yeah. So one of the things I want to get done is first-party support for, like, now Blazor in version 5 of .NET, they're shipping with components in the box that actually require the JavaScript interrupt to work. So I want to have built-in already set up handlers for that in the fake JavaScript interrupt I have in bUnit. But it's proving a bit hard. I'm hoping that some of the Blazor team members will help me out, because figure out their internal protocols for calling each other in between the JavaScript and their components. It's taking a bit of time, but hopefully within 14 days that should be done.
Yeah. Well, our friend Michael Jolly over on the Bald Bearded Builder channel on Twitch is doing a full week of Blazor next week, I think. So maybe jump in chat and yell at them and say, do this.
I've been hanging out with Jeff Rich, and he's been using bUnit since last year, when he started writing his web forms for Blazor components project. So, and he's strictly using the Razor-based syntax that I talked about. So yeah, that's also a good place to. What was it, Clayton? You said that you have to actually learn about things. So you have to go on Twitch.
Yeah, well, he's live now, so I'm gonna.
Right, because I did.
I'll be watching that whenever we hang up.
Oh, he's over on the Visual Studio channel this morning. Okay.
Yeah. I think Monday is like learning C# with C# Rich. So it's I don't think there's too much Blazor in that. It's just basic C# stuff. But Yeah, but yeah, do let me know if you have any issues. I would love to help out and jump on a stream with you at some time.
Yeah.
If we can get the time zones to work out.
Yeah, well, I'll be using bUnit with I'm gonna give it a whirl on the Blazor game and see how that goes.
Cool.
There have been a lot of there's been a lot of asynchronous exceptions that have happened, and they just disappear. And so maybe it would help me catch those because just the way it's running, it's not running in the browser.
Yeah, I think the trick with bUnit, which I didn't mention, and that's sort of, like I said, the most advanced stuff in bUnit is that we're doing the same thing like we are doing in the browser, where the browser is running the JavaScript part of Blazor, and then you have that bridge to the C# part, and that might run on the server or run in WebAssembler. But that's two different processes in when you're running just a regular Blazor application. There's two different processes for JavaScript to one part, but when we're running in test code, then you have C#. You have it's basically two different threads running at the same time. You have a test code running in its own test context in XUnit, for example, in Unit, and then you have the Blazor renderer running in another thread, because otherwise there could be deadlocks. If you have asynchronous code running in your renderer, then you might have your test code waiting for a render to happen, and you might have your renderer waiting to actually do that render. So that's why you have two different threads. It does complicate things a little bit, because then you have to actually properly wait in your test for something to happen if it's asynchronous. If it's triggered asynchronously or it just happens through timers or whatever. But if there is an exception in the render thread, then it should be propagated back to the test, and you should get it there as well.
Mm-hmm.
But if you have a test example where you can't get that to actually happen, let me know, because there's definitely some. That might be a corner case that I not necessarily cover. I have never had a question about it though, so it might just be working and nobody's reporting back that it's not working.
You'd be surprised the dumb things I can do in code. Well,
yeah. That's always something. If you have to give people advice at some point, young people, that could also be just give your code to somebody, give your application or whatever you are building, give it to somebody to use. And that's always very humbling and also very eye-opening. And you have to bite your tongue to say, why are you doing like that? That's completely wrong. That's not how I intended to use. But the user is always right in that regard. So it's very interesting. It's interesting to see. I've seen some streamers where people use bUnit or write articles about it, where I'm like, no, that's not quite what I intended, but okay, I guess it works as well. Where you just see people take a very long road to get to somewhere where I really want to design an API where they just land in the pit of success, if that's a term you can use in English. And sometimes I see examples of where people are taking a very long road that could have been very short. So I try really to sort of make the API as taking them on the right journey.
Yeah.
Anyway, guys, I have to get back to work as well.
Yep.
And I assume you have to as well.
Yeah.
But it was very nice talking to you, and let me know if you want to hang out again on some time.
Yeah,
right.
Absolutely. We'll do.
thank you.
Okay, great. Cheers.
good
Bye-bye.
day.
Bye.
You too.
Yeah, everybody got uploaded. Everything's good except for the missing 10 minutes of. Sorry.
Because you said Stream Deck didn't push buttons or something, or
No, that was just. I mean, so the Stream Deck buttons not working threw me off, but the Zencaster button is just. I have to hit that normally. I was just multiple processes and one of them failed.
nice. All right, 6 o'clock.
Yep. Talk to you then.
See you.
Bye.
One thing I've learned, everything looks better on the big screen.